Many people aren't sure what good journalism is today, and we look out there, and we see journalists right now who I'm not sure are sure what good journalism is, especially investigative journalism, but this next person is. She's a seasoned CBS reporter. She received a 2013 Daytime Emmy Award as part of the CBS Sunday morning team's entry for Outstanding Morning Program for her report, Washington Lobbying, K Street, Behind Closed Doors. She is a person who has received an Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism for her reporting on the business of Congress. She also received Emmy nomination in 2013 for Benghazi, Dying for Security and Green Energy Going Red. She is a person who is an author right now of an outstanding book that's out there, and it's called Stonewalled. Yep. And it talks about trying to do your job right now amidst all of the pressure that she's getting from elsewhere, including CBS. Stonewalled is how her news reports were met with a barrage of PR warfare tactics, including online criticism as well as emails and phone calls up the network chain of command. And all the nasty stuff that's going out there. Stonewalled, my fight for truth against the forces of obstruction, intimidation, and harassment in Obama's Washington. She also will be the featured speaker at the PA Leadership Conference coming up this weekend, Friday and Saturday at the Radisson Penn Harris Convention Center in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. And with all that said, we welcome Sharyl Attkisson to the show. Sharyl, till I get done reading that whole thing, the segment's almost over, but great to have you in this morning.
Thank you for the introduction.
Sharyl, a lot of us watched you, and a lot of people talk about the media, and we look at a certain channel and we say, okay, they're going to say this, they're going to take this side, Fox is going to be right, CBS is going to be left, NBC is going to be left, MSNBC is going to be way left. And yet you're a person that people have looked at for a long time and said, she's pretty fair. She goes out and actually does what she's supposed to be doing. And yet there came a time where that all ended at CBS, right?
Well, at the end of CBS, I would say for most of my career there, I had great bosses who wanted the sort of reporting where they didn't dictate where it was going to go and how it was going to end. But I felt that the last couple of years, my producer, and many of my colleagues complained that that was no longer the case, and there were just a host of problems. But it resulted in the inability to get great, original, and investigative stories on the air.
Break that down for us. How did that happen? What kind of things were done? What kind of pressure was brought to bear?
Well, initially, even the managers I'm speaking of would occasionally like a great story or assign me to a story, such as Benghazi and healthcare.gov. Those were assignments. Those weren't my idea. But after extraordinary pushback from forces that are view themselves as targets of these stories, I assume they didn't like the pushback. They would suddenly lose interest in the story. I don't know at what levels all the pushback occurs, but all of a sudden the story that they loved yesterday, no matter what you found the next day, they didn't want anymore, and sort of treated you almost as if you're a troublemaker for continuing to follow it, which is one of the things I do best, is not let go of a good story while there's still information to be developed. There's also just, I think, a general tendency across the board at all the networks and a lot of print outlets and reporters will discuss that managers just don't want this sort of reporting anymore, whether it ruffles corporate interests or is just too much of a headache. It's hard to say because it's very popular reporting among viewers and readers, but not so much among certain managers these days. So there was also that pressure, not just political pressure, but in general, pressures not to air this sort of reporting. I'll point out Lisa Myers and Michael Isikoff left NBC shortly after I left CBS, I think much for the same reasons. Armin Katayan left the CBS investigative unit before I left CBS, I think for much the same reasons.
You know, Americans today like to sit back and think that we have a country that's open and transparent, and yet we don't realize that we are kind of at the mercy of a lot of powerful figures, not just in government, but in business as well, who are entirely unaccountable, and they're behind the scenes. How much did you get to see them up close and personal?
Well, you do get to see a lot, but a lot of it is manipulated information. I think it's never been more the case that what you see, whether it's on the news or social media or what nonprofits put out or letters to the editor, these strings are being pulled by people trying to manipulate your opinion and are using paid and sophisticated ways to make you think these are grassroots efforts, these are stories that are occurring organically and naturally, when in fact there's a lot of money and power behind the information being shoved at you every day versus the way it should be done, which I think in news is the reporters ought to be without an agenda, just at the ground level, seeking truth on a variety of subjects that the powers that be don't want you to cover, rather than eating the spoon-fed information being handed to us day to day. And I think a lot of that's going on right now.
You know, one of the things that bothers me a lot, and I've kind of got a theory, and I can't think of a better person to ask to validate it or slap me across verbally, I remember the days of the Woodward-Bernstein investigation that led to Watergate and led to a president stepping down and resigning. And I remember it started out as kind of a nothing story, and yet it turned into the story of our time, where we had a president who no other president's ever stepped down in history. And so I thought, wow. And then when you watch All the President's Men, and you read the story and you hear from Woodward and Bernstein, and, they kind of did what you did. I mean, they followed a story until it went to a certain place. They weren't quite sure where that led. And it seems to me that there were a lot of people at that time, would-be journalists, who looked at that and said, okay, we can be famous doing this. Well, let's start out, let's put at the top what we want to have happen and build in underneath. Is that the case or not? I mean, did investigative journalism turn into opinion journalism at that point, or had it already occurred before that?
Gosh, it's hard to say. I'm not really an expert on that, how things have changed throughout time, but I can only tell you they had a lot of roadblocks, and their colleagues were not necessarily supporting them initially. There's some amount of jealousy against the Woodwards and Bernsteins when they would come up with information that others couldn't match. That's been seen in the past, that others would try to maybe undercut the story. The bosses were afraid of it because of the pushback, but they persisted, and you're right, it wasn't an overnight story. That's something that took a lot of time. I just don't think there's the stomach for it now, the attention span. Not on the part of the public. People accuse the public of not being interested, not caring. I disagree. If reported properly, people would care and do pay attention. And there is an element, maybe not everybody, but a significant element of the public that wants to see stories like this. But there's just not the appetite on the part of some key managers at news organizations. And I don't know if that's just a coincidence that they all are seeming to feel this way, or so many of them in the past couple of years, or if there's some bigger trend at play. But they just don't want, in many cases, a story pursued to the end. And yet they welcome, as you mentioned, opinion journalism. They welcome journalism that fits their opinions and ideas of what ought to be said, which I think is the opposite of what we ought to be doing. You're supposed to divorce yourself from your personal interests and opinions unless the opinions are fact-based, based on the research you've done for a particular story. Your personal opinion, you're supposed to come out of it, and you're supposed to be able to follow the facts, even if they go in the opposite direction of something that you saw. It's a great intellectual challenge for a journalist.
We're talking with Sharyl Attkisson, investigative journalist and author of the best-selling book Stonewalled, My Fight for Truth Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation, and Harassment in Obama's Washington. Have you ever had a boss come up to you, or some colleague, because we have this vision that every major station in the country, every major newspaper in the country is filled with all these liberals in the room, all these left-leaning people. Have you ever had someone come up and say, Cheryl, what are you doing? I mean, this is like the old-time journalism. I mean, the things you're describing are exactly, I'm sitting there with my pom-poms out going, way to go. And it's what we knew of you watching you out in the national stage when so much was going on there, and you were out there on the news every night because of your stance. So have you ever had anybody come up to you and just say, you need to get off that. Come on, get on our side here and start doing it the way we're doing it?
No, nobody's ever said anything like that. And there's a diverse mix of opinions in newsrooms. But the last couple of years, the key people at CBS, in my view, did have political vested interests that couldn't allow them to see straight and see fairly on a story. And a lot of people at CBS, even colleagues who call themselves liberals, felt the same way about these managers.
Yeah.
They've made some changes there, but I just think that culturally these things persist.
You talk in the title of your book about the Obama administration, and you said they've broken new ground in their monitoring of journalists, intimidation, harassment of opposition groups, surveillance of private citizens. Talk about the things here that you have seen, and I know harassment and even monitoring have gone on with regard to your situation. Am I correct?
That's right, and it's not just my saying so. There's a consensus, whether it's Reporters Without Borders, reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the White House Correspondents Association, the Photographers Association. Across the board, this has been said about this administration. So it's not just an opinion that's in question. And in my case, yes, I discovered with the help of sources that there had been a long-term monitoring and surveillance effort in my CBS laptop and my personal desktop computer I don't think I'm the only one. We now know, since that happened, that the government was doing, I think, inappropriate things to the Associated Press in terms of secretly confiscating phone records, what they were doing in targeting James Rosen of Fox News and leak investigation and so on. So I doubt I'm the only one, but I think you could look at a number of reporters believed to be doing critical reporting on this government, and I assume they were likewise being watched. I just happen to have the luck of sources and expertise that came to me that was able to detect the specific software dates and times and so on.
You've also seen the opponents of transparency go to even bigger lengths, I guess, to discourage and obstruct legitimate reporting, right?
Yes, I mean, it's sort of an interlocked problem.
Yeah.
The forces that want to stop news reporting have learned how to manipulate us in ways that the news outlets really can't fight or don't want to fight, because we're just sort of outmatched by these PR efforts that have been working for years on these tactics, and we're not. We're just out there reporting the news. We don't really know how to, we don't have the time and energy and money to push back, but they hire PR firms that do, get blogs like Media Matters to write false talking points that get picked up by partner blogs that make it seem like there's a grassroots outswelling or outpouring of opinion about a subject when there's not. They may use pseudonyms on Facebook and Twitter, maybe 50 to one person, to make it appear as if 50 people think something. They may monitor every story a person writes on a topic they're trying to discourage so that they can comment negatively and disparage the reporter and controversialize the news outlet that's reporting these things. Again, it's a very broad, sophisticated effort, and I think it's been fairly successful in many cases.
You received an Emmy for outstanding investigative journalism in 2012 for the Gunwalker Fast and Furious story. A lot of people have seen that one kind of get swept under the rug here at the end, and yet you're one of the people that exposed that. You exposed a lot on Benghazi. Tell us a little bit about those two investigations that you conducted.
Fast and Furious was, I would say, what I call an organic story that sort of came to me and my producer without us looking for it, through a tip and a contact. It wasn't anybody trying to push it. In fact, everybody was trying to get away from that story. Initially, when we started reporting on it, this is the effort that federal agents were secretly using that facilitated the delivery of thousands of assault rifles and other weapons into the hands of Mexican drug cartels. And as we exposed this effort, I can tell you both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill were considering jumping aboard on the issue, because I was talking to staffers and members on both sides. And they could not quite figure out the calculus, if that would help them with their gun rights people or if the story would hurt them with their gun rights people. And this is how cynical it gets sometimes. I would say to these staffers and members, isn't just an issue sometimes just an issue of importance, regardless of what you think it would do to a certain constituency? And they would say things like, well, sadly, no. So in the end, the Democrats decided not to take up the issue, and the Republicans did, which made the Democrats spin an issue they were very much thinking of getting behind. They then forevermore spun it as partisan and controversialized it as a Republican witch hunt. It easily could have gone the other way, but I think when they saw that there were perhaps administration ties to this program, Democrats were either encouraged by the administration to stay away from it, or on their own saw that might be a good idea for them.
Sure, we're going to...
sorry, go ahead.
My fault. We're going to take a very quick break here. I want to come back, and I want you can finish up and talk a little bit more about that. And I also want to ask you about Benghazi, which is still kind of out there, and again, the same kind of thing going on. I want to get your thoughts on that as well. We'll be right back with Sharyl Attkisson. She is going to be a featured speaker this week at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. It's a premier gathering of conservatives each year in the Keystone State. It's the largest and longest running of the state-based conservative conferences, regularly attracting a long list of elected officials, scholars, journalists, and activists. And obviously, Sharyl Attkisson will be there with the keynote address on Friday night, this coming Friday, at the Radisson Hotel in Harrisburg. We'll be back with more from Sharyl right after this on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show. We're talking with Sharyl Attkisson, who is an investigative journalist, author of the best-selling book Stonewalled, My Fight for Truth Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation, and Harassment in Obama's Washington. You know, Sharyl, I'm reminded of something. I was a history teacher for 25 years before I did this. I'm reminded of something Harry Truman once said. He said, and he was called Give 'em Hell Harry. He said, I never gave anyone hell. I just told them the truth. They thought that's what it was. The same could be said about you sometimes. You on Benghazi, on Fast and Furious, you're a person to a certain element out there. You tell the truth, and they think it's hell coming their way, right?
Yeah, I think that's the case. You mentioned to move off of Fast and Furious to Benghazi. With that story, it was a little bit different because Fast and Furious was a story that I came up with and offered to the company, but Benghazi was something CBS asked me to look into a couple of weeks into the story. They felt there was a lot more to it. And like I describe in my book with a number of stories at CBS, they started out very enthusiastically. We were really uncovering a lot of good reporting, my producer and I and other people at CBS.
Yep.
And after a couple of weeks with incredible pushback, really hard pushback coming from the administration, almost overnight, it seemed to me, they lost interest and soured on the story, didn't want the administration discussed, just seemed to totally change their mind on it, as had happened with several other stories.
And I imagine there you sit. You've got a certain amount of ethics. You're a person that says, "Oh, you put me on this. You know what I do. You know I'm an investigative reporter. You know I'm going to follow it where it leads. Why all of a sudden you're asked now? Oh, now you got to back off. That's. I mean, the red flags have just be flying up everywhere.
Well, they go from patting you on the back and you're sort of the office hero for a couple of days or a couple of weeks to everybody starts to sense when they don't want a story, and even when my local bosses would still try to help push those stories because they were always trying to help. They didn't agree with the decisions being made in New York many times about these things, but people would start to look. You'd come in the newsroom, instead of patting you on the back, they'd start to kind of skulk around and divert eye contact, and the whole mood changes. And everybody knows they don't want that story anymore. They'll say that the local managers will say about New York, they don't want it anymore. They don't want it. We know they don't want it. And we don't always know why, but we can always tell when that decision's been made.
I have a vision here of Sharyl Attkisson having some kind of conversation that went like this. Come on, who's really putting the heat on you? Did you ever have that conversation and someone came clean and said, yeah, here's where it's coming from?
Not really. I was not that direct. We just you sort of knew. And there were some direct conversations that happened that it didn't require that questioning. I was told by a manager years ago when I had fewer of these problems, but years ago when they were trying to stop a story, I had already won an Emmy investigating the Red Cross, and I was working on further stories about the American Red Cross. And I had a manager sort of in disgust throw up her hands and say, I've been told by the news division president we must do nothing to upset our corporate partners until the stock splits.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, wow. Another time, more recently, with a great executive producer on Evening News, we came under extraordinary pressure from the sales department at CBS and pharmaceutical advertisers because I had been assigned to do a lot of pharmaceutical company and vaccine side effect reporting, which is very popular among the public. Others were doing it too. And that practically stopped in some sense suddenly after some decision, It seems to me, had been made. And the executive producer describes getting a phone call from the sales department as we were reporting on statin drugs, cholesterol-lowering drugs, and the salesman, I think very inappropriate call said, this is really going to hurt CBS if you keep up with these stories.
Yep. Sharyl, great interview this morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing it the right way. Again, the name of the book out there is Stonewalled, My Fight for Truth Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation, and Harassment in Obama's Washington. You can check out Sheryl's speech April 17th at the Radisson Penn Harris Convention Center in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, not too far from here at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. Call and get information or go to PennsylvaniaLeadershipConference.com. Sharyl, I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much. It was very refreshing.
Thank you very much.
Take care and have a good speech this week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Sharyl Attkisson with us on the Gary Sutton Show.